University Schar School of Policy and Government. I'm also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And I'm joined by three excellent speakers, Kimberly Donovan, Deborah LaPravotte, hope I've got that right, and Aurora Ortega. I'm hoping that you can each just briefly introduce yourselves, starting with Kimberly.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me today. I'm Kimberly Donovan. I am the director of the Economic Statecraft Initiative within the Geoeconomic Center at the Atlantic Council. Within the Geoeconomic Center, we focus on issues at the intersection of finance, economics, and foreign policy. And prior to joining the Atlantic Council, I served in the U.S. federal government for 15 years, covering anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism.
Thank you. Deborah?
Hello, everyone. I'm Debbie LaPravotte. For the last 7.5 years, I have worked for the Sentry as a senior investigator, investigating greed that facilitates war crimes and atrocities in Central Africa. Prior to that, I spent 20 years with the FBI, retiring as a supervisory special agent, working international corruption.
Very good. Thank you. And Aurora?
Hi, I'm Aurora Ortega. I am currently a government employee in the federal government, and I've held various positions within Treasury and the Department of Defense. I've been a member of the intelligence community for just shy of 20 years. And I do want to caveat that anything I say here today does not represent the views of the federal government or any department or agency they're in. They're all my own views. And I'm also a PhD student at George Mason University.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, let's get into it. And I think first question I'd like to address to Debbie. You were in Kiev in 2014 when former President Yanukovych and his cronies fled to Russia, and Russia invaded and annexed Crimea. How would you describe the economic effects of corruption in Ukraine at the time and those ties to Russia?
Well, it's really remarkable that corruption was probably one of the biggest facilitators of the downfall of Yanukovych and had the largest detriment to the economy in Ukraine. I mean, there's obviously other factors, but what it came down to is under Yanukovych, basically about $40 billion left the country. And it was either drained out, I mean, just not all into the pockets of President Yanukovych, but through special deals and tax evasion and corruption, inflated contracts, faulty loans where the Ukrainian government had to bail out those loans. There's just a myriad of corruption schemes that ultimately drained the economy of at least $40 billion, which opened the door to Russia's invasion in 2014. If you look at it, one of the things Yanukovych did was divert so much money away from the military and into aspects of the armed forces that he had more control over. And so at the time of the invasion in 2014, there were about only 7,000 really functioning soldiers in the Ukrainian military. And I arrived 2 weeks after Yanukovych fled. And, I walk into the embassy and I'm meeting with my Ukrainian counterparts. I'm like, hi, I'm Debbie LaPravotte. I'm here with the FBI. And the guy looked at me and goes, we're being invaded. Could you come back? And I'm like, yeah, that's why we're here, right? I mean, but what they were looking at is that they had this military invasion lining up on the eastern border, and they had no bullets, right? They had no capability of fighting. And that is a direct correlation to the money. And obviously, Yanukovych was pro-Kremlin, pro-Ukraine. So all of this money left Ukraine. It weakened their military. It opened the invasion and then ultimately the annexing of Crimea. So there's this huge correlation. I worked with my colleagues for years trying to trace so much of the money that left Ukraine, because even though 40 billion left, the detriment or the impact on the economy was closer to $100 billion of lost revenues and damage to the economy. So it was just there's no accounting for the situation that Ukraine was in without factoring in the role played by corruption.
That is fascinating. I have to admit, I had never heard that I'd always wondered why Ukrainian forces didn't resist. I hadn't understood that it was because they couldn't, because the money was gone. Okay, let's turn to sanctions evasion and money. And is there some kind of back? Is the recording, is the audio okay? Okay, I'm getting some kind of feedback. Well, next question I have is, since the start of Russia's invasion into Ukraine last year, we've seen hundreds of sanctions levied against Russia. And under the Trump administration, we saw hundreds of sanctions levied against Iran. What would you say are the similarities and differences between the two? And Aurora, maybe each of you in turn can address this, but why don't we ask Aurora first?
Sure, thank you. There are definitely a lot of similarities. There's, I think, even more differences in the sanctions themselves, the types of sanctions that were levied, and who actually imposed those sanctions on Russia and Iran. As you know, with Russia, we've seen sanctions from all over the world, from not only the US, but European partners and Japan. With Iran, it was solely the US going after Iran and their malicious acts by issuing sanctions. And that's had different effects, and also the types of sanctions. During this invasion of Russia into Ukraine, a lot of the sanctions, particularly against the financial sector, have been non-blocking sanctions, which are not as strong as the full blocking sanctions that we saw with issued against Iran and Iranian banks. And again, with the tradecraft, we see a lot of similarities in the tradecraft that Iran and Russia have used to evade these sanctions. And a lot of it's not by coincidence. It's the alliance between the two countries. Iran actually was able to work with Russia and expedite Russia's knowledge of how to evade sanctions again and get their oil shipments out. And we actually saw Russia and Iran work together, and with Iran's proxy Hezbollah, as far back as 2018 to start evading sanctions via oil trade. And that was actually, again, Russia was not evading. There were no Russian sanctions at the time, right before the invasion. They were evading Syrian sanctions. So Russia was trying to get its money out of Syria, but couldn't because of the sanctions levied against Syria. And Iran needed money, move its money to the Levant, to its proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas, and couldn't. So they actually developed a scheme where Russia would help move Iran's money to the Levant, and the Iranians would help move the Russian money out of Syria to Russia.
Interesting. Okay. Kim, would you care to add anything to that?
Sure, I just want to pick up on the point that Aurora made in the beginning, where I think a key difference between the sanctions against Iran and Russia are the fact that the Russia sanctions are truly multilateral. And I do apologize there for the background noise. I don't have much control over it at the moment. But the fact that the Russia sanctions against Russia are really G7 and part of a broader coalition, it makes them that much broader and stronger. So it's not just the US jurisdiction that needs to comply with the sanctions. It is also those of the EU and Japan and beyond. So I think that's one of also the key distinctions, is just the multilateralness of the sanctions against Russia versus Iran. During the Trump administration, it really was the US kind of going at it alone.
Oh, very good. Debbie, would you care to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just go back to 2014, comparing it to now also, is that one of the problems when we were trying to get allies in Europe at the time, they all relied on Gazprom, right? Russian gas, and it was February, so it's their winter. Now you notice again, when did they invade again? They invaded in February. And is that the modus operandi, where they know that a lot of the countries that rely on Russian gas can't go up against them as winter is in full swing. So what we've seen because of the sanctions, though, is that Europe is moving away from the Russian gas pipeline and moving towards natural gas. I think that's a very positive impact from the sanctions. And, my other two colleagues have covered it. I think there are a lot of similarities. One thing that it has done is focused them into relying on each other. Iran and Russia, of course, China and North Korea are the bad boys of kind of the world at the moment. Add Syria to that list. And it's given them the opportunity to work with each other to try to avoid sanctions.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's talk about the dark fleet, also known as the shadow fleet. Are Russia and Iran actually using the same networks and ships? Aurora, what do you have to say about this?
Sure. Yeah, as I mentioned, as far back as 2018, we saw Russia and Iran start working together, again, with Hezbollah as well, to set up these networks to move oil. It's definitely evolved since then, and we're seeing a lot more networks. And again, now that's not just these gray fleets where it's like they're doing what they can to evade sanctions under the radar. These are ships that are, they're not licensed, they're completely ghost ships to some extent. And, some of the networks we have seen are shared networks, some are not. But I think one of the things that we're seeing more is there's more third-party actors. So these are not necessarily Russian state-owned networks or Iran state-owned networks or controlled networks. These are third-party networks that are actually used by both Russia and Iran in some cases. And sometimes they don't necessarily service both, but they do provide services, and either they don't. So that way, neither Russia or Iran is reliant on one single network.
Very good. Kim, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so just to again follow on Aurora's comments, based on some analysis that we did at the Atlantic Council earlier this year, we were assessed that as of February of 2023, Russia's shadow fleet was worth more than $2 billion. And even at that time consisted of around 600 different vessels. And what we found really interesting with this is that the fleet included tankers that were previously used by Iranian as well as Venezuelan oil shipments, and also European tankers had been sold to Middle Eastern as well as Asian owners since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And as Aurora pointed out, it's very difficult to kind of really understand who the true owner and beneficial owner of these tankers are. I think the interesting aspect of the dark fleet or shadow fleet with Russia is that it is a way that Russia is circumventing the oil price cap, which was one of the measures that G7 partners applied against Russia in response to the invasion of Ukraine in order to deny Russia resources and revenue that it needed from its primary commodity of oil.
Very good. Oh,
Ongoing issue.
sorry. Okay. I have another question, hopefully for Debbie. Now, both Russia and Iran move their money through or stash it in various countries. Is there any significant overlap worth highlighting?
It really is. It's interesting because if you're looking like where Russia is offshoring their wealth, right? They want to make it secure. Right now, there's over $200 billion allegedly of Russian money in Swiss banks. And what's so interesting about that is that we have found through investigation that Russia has infiltrated through the use of bribery, intimidation, and extortion into the Swiss banking system, as well as into Swiss law enforcement. I think it was last year, one of their top prosecutors ended up resigning and then being charged and convicted of bribery charges. And so not only are they just offshoring their wealth there, but they're using bribery and extortion and intimidation to get and stay in that banking system. But years ago, even a decade ago, people said, well, who's the new Switzerland? I'm like, it's Dubai, it's Abu Dhabi, it's the UAE, right? So if you look at Russian and Iranian money being funneled into the UAE, in 2022, there was a 125% increase in the sale of properties to Russians in the UAE. And what's really interesting, there are over 1 million Iranians living in the UAE, and they are major property owners. So, if you want to look at where the overlap is, it's the UAE and the property and the real estate sector.
Wow, I had not known that. That really is fascinating. Kim, you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, just to follow on what Debbie was saying, I mean, the UAE, in my mind, is really a major issue here, because they also have had a history of facilitating, or at least their financial institutions, and specifically their exchange houses, have had a history of facilitating terrorist financing. So not only is it the money that Russia is trying to hide, or that Iran may be trying to hide, but you can look at the series of different treasury designations that have come out over the past several years, and all of the money that Quds Force is trying to funnel to Hezbollah, as well as groups like Hamas, especially what, I think is front and center with the current situation going on right now. A lot of that money has been funneled through exchange houses in the UAE. And when pressed upon, the Emirati government will do something about it. But the fact that this activity continues to happen, Treasury in particular continues to designate, that has also now gotten the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, which is the international body that sets standards for anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism. They have gray listed the UAE. This is a very big deal. I mean, Dubai has been trying to be the financial hub of the Middle East. I mean, there's a ton of money there. And if the FATF has decided holistically that the UAE is on the gray list, that means that their AML CFT standards are not up to par, that terrorist money, that other money laundering is occurring within their jurisdiction. And I think that's something the UAE really needs to start paying attention to, especially when you have the influx of Russians and Russian money, in addition to Iranians and the Iranian money, as Debbie pointed out.
Wow, gosh, with friends like these, interesting. Well, moving on, Aurora, can you talk a bit about how asset blocking and recovery, a bit about that, and how successful or not that has been?
Yeah, so the asset blocking, I'll talk a little bit about that. I think Debbie might have a little bit more background than I do on recovery. But asset blocking, I think this goes back to some of the types of sanctions that have been levied against Iran and Russia, particularly Russia, with the blocking and non-blocking sanctions. Blocking sanctions, again, when those are levied, that means that the entity, say a bank, not only is it that the U.S. cannot do business with the entity that has been designated. So, banks that have dollar accounts that have foreign correspondent banks are not able to move those monies, are not able to move those transactions, but they're also supposed to freeze the money. So if there's any money that is transferring through the banks, those have to be held, and that's more effective. Again, because in this case, Russia or Iran would not have access to that money, and it's held normally in an escrow account until it's determined that that money can be released. With non-blocking sanctions, assets are not frozen. U.S. entities cannot do business with the entity. So a Russian bank, the U.S. entities would not be able to make the transfers, but they would return that money to the actor. And so again, it allows for the designated actor to continue to have their money and just not transact through the U.S. Financial sector or through U.S. entities. And I think that's a big difference in the effectiveness of the sanctions and the types of sanctions that should be levied in certain situations.
Very good. Debbie, can we turn to you?
Yeah, obviously I did asset recovery for the majority of my FBI career. And so I was really impressed with the task force klepto capture that was set up by the United States Department of Justice after the invasion into Ukraine. And so far over $1 billion worth of assets have been seized. And I mean, that's aircraft, that's the yachts that everybody heard about. It's real property, it's bank accounts, investment accounts. And what's interesting, and what people don't realize, like when you seize a yacht, that's the easy part, right? I mean, because then you have to move it, you have to maintain it, you have to find someplace that is like a marina large enough to maintain several huge yachts. A crew that, I mean, there's a lot that goes into seizing an aircraft, a yacht, maintaining a property. And, but some of those assets have already been forfeited because the individual didn't contest the forfeiture. So that money will get returned to Ukraine. I think the good news is that over the next year or so, more of these assets not only have been seized, maybe additional ones will be seized, but these will get forfeited. And that money will be able to go back to, will be given to Ukraine. And I know that there are a lot of entities out there right now working on trying to recover Yanukovych assets that left under President Poroshenko, because those are Ukraine's assets. And if that money can be recovered, it is much easier to give that money back to Ukraine as well. So, I mean, there's a lot going on. A lot of people don't remember, but in 2003, the FBI seized $258 million from Pavel Lazarenko, the former prime minister of Ukraine, and he fought it. So for 20 years, that's why, meaning even today, that's being fought. But I think that litigation is finally coming to a successful end. And there's another 258 million or so that will also go back to Ukraine. So there's a lot of really good work that's being done, and hopefully additional assets will continue to be located and frozen.
Wow, just in time for that 258 million. Kimberly, can I turn to you, please?
Yeah, just to continue on with Aurora and Debbie's comments, I did want to make a quick distinction between the sovereign assets that have been immobilized and the individuals and entities that have been designated, such as the oligarchs. Because there's two different paths of money. And I know that there's a lot of conversation on the Hill, in the UAE, and across departments and agencies on what to do with this money. So as Demi noted, I mean, there's a fantastic initiative with the Task Force Klepto Capture, where they are going after the oligarchs' money. And I mean, they've identified like $58 billion worth of assets, which is not it's not nothing. That's a lot of money. And they have worked with the State Department to develop a mechanism to transfer the money that is eventually seized through the judicial process over to Ukraine, which I think that's such a creative mechanism and a really great initiative. There's the other issue of the Russian sovereign assets and wealth fund. So at the beginning of Russia's invasion, one of the things that G7 partners did was immobilize Russian sovereign assets. So all of this money, as Aurora kind of explained, the blocking versus freezing aspects, this money is locked in place. Like Russia cannot access its sovereign wealth fund and its sovereign assets in other jurisdictions that are complying with these sanctions. So that's $300 billion worth of money. And over the course of the last year, G7 partners, including the US, have been working with financial institutions and requiring them to report where this money is. So as a result of that, this past a couple months ago, it might have just been last month, but the repo task force, which is a task force made up of different finance ministries and others across the G7 countries involved in this work, they released a report explaining that they've identified about like $280 billion worth of this $300 billion. It's primarily in European jurisdictions. And I think that is also a result of the fact that following the 2014 invasion and especially the US sanctions that went against Russia, Russia started divesting of US treasuries and trying to de-risk and mitigate the potential consequences of further sanctions. So I think that's why we end up seeing a lot more money in the European jurisdictions. And right now, I know that the EU has some ongoing conversations on what can we do about this money. There's arguments to just seize it right now, send it to Ukraine. However, there's a lot of legal obstacles through that I know others are trying to work through. And then there's some other kind of creative ideas that even like the Belgians have right now, where a significant portion of this money is actually in Euroclear, which is based in Brussels, and based on their tax system. And because this money is being held in escrow, it's earned interest, and so it can be taxed. And so as a result of this, Belgium is taxing it, and they're sending that money to Ukraine. So this they're calling it a windfall approach. So that I know is something that's being discussed among EU partners right now to figure out, is this a way that we can really hold Russia accountable for the reconstruction of Ukraine and for the damage that it's done. And because it's a big pot of money, I know taxpayers are like, we don't want to pay for this. And so it's like, let's get creative on how we can get Russia to pay.
That's marvelous. And of course, interest rates are going up. So that means the take is increasing. Well, we do have a couple of questions from the audience. Claire Marquette wrote in to say that the research program that she leads is funding a number of projects looking at sanctions evasion and avoidance, but it's also coming through as a significant challenge in other research that's ostensibly nothing to do with sanctions. And she would welcome panelists' thoughts on how far they see the growing use of sanctions as a tool by Western governments in shaping and reshaping illicit economies and geopolitical relationships as a concern, including whether or not they see the potential implications of this being discussed widely enough. Would anyone care to tackle that?
I can start it, or
Please.
Kim, if you would like to start, go ahead.
So within the Geoeconomic Center at the Atlantic Council, we actually just hosted a huge conference a couple of weeks ago in Berlin. It was called the Transatlantic Forum on Geoeconomics, and we focused specifically on economic statecrafts. And the way that we define economic statecraft is all of these different tools. So the sanctions, export controls, as well as positive sides and inducement and aid that can be applied. And so, you know, we also had a report that came out in conjunction with this that covered a lot of these different topics. And I mean, what we're seeing, I mean, this economic statecraft has really become the go-to tools to address like pretty much every single national security threat out there. I mean, it's more than diplomacy, but it's short of military intervention. You know, there's not necessarily a loss of life that can come along with it, especially like at least on a military capacity. And so it's really constantly being seen of like, how can we use the power, not only of the US, but also the Western partners and economies as almost a weapon to address some of these different challenges and to compel these different regimes or bad actors to change their behavior. So I think that this is a growing field. I don't anticipate, especially on the US side, to be stopping with sanctions anytime soon. But it's also, you know, to the participants' question, I think it is something that we really need to dig more into, and we need to figure out how we can not necessarily develop a doctrine, because to me that's like, that language is a little too militaristic and set, but some type of framework that we can all think through how these measures can be applied. Because even in the case of Russia, we've seen how it's been very different creative ways, whether it's the price cap, de-swifting, freezing of sovereign assets, in addition to the individual sanctions and designations and export controls. It's a very fluid space, and I think that we need to do a lot more research and understand the implications for down the road, and be able to better assess, you know, what are the true impacts going into these actions, and develop some different types of measures of effectiveness around them. But Aurora, I turn to you.
Yeah, I'd just like to add something very brief on how it could be shaping or reshaping illicit economies with regard to some of the illicit actors that are involved. Because again, you think of Iran, and Iran is a, you know, state sponsor of terrorism, you know, sponsoring groups like Hezbollah, like Hamas, you know, and militia groups in Iraq and Yemen. So you have groups throughout the region, but some of these groups, particularly Hezbollah, operate worldwide. And a lot of the sanctions you see actually have shaped how Iran moves money to these entities, and how these entities themselves move money, like Hezbollah will move money from diaspora communities or other parts of the world where they operate and generate revenue back to Lebanon or wherever in the Middle East that they need that money. So again, the dark fleet is a great example of that. This is something we didn't see prior to 2018. The reason that we saw it in 2018 is that the primary method, or a key method at least, that Iran used, the IRGC-QF, Quds Force, used to move money to Hezbollah was a bank in Iraq. And that bank was designated in 2018. And so this new method of moving money was developed as a substitute for that designation. They needed a new tradecraft because the sanctions were coming so hard on not only financiers, but the actual methods and the entities used to move money. So again, disruptions do cause the mechanisms to be disrupted, and that does result in these illicit economies evolving their tradecraft.
Very good. Debbie, did you want to add to this?
Yeah, just real briefly, to follow on what both of my colleagues said, it's creating new pathways. And so one of the things I think we have to be diligent about is like Iran is using front companies that are registered in the UK and Malta and Switzerland. So these countries not only have to be watching their financial sector, but they have to be looking at, are they wittingly or unwittingly being used to help evade sanctions by their registration of their ease of registering companies. And I mean, the US is responsible for the ease at which a company can be used for bad reasons. But I think it's creating new pathways, and we have to realize that we have to address it on so many fronts. And one of those is the registration of companies, and then those companies are being used to open bank accounts. And because they're a UK company, a Malta company, or a Swiss company, they're not being sanctioned or being identified as facilitators to avoid sanctions.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, well, I have a lot more questions on my list. So let's move to another topic, this one being worldwide consequences. Now, outside of sanctions evasion and illicit finance schemes, are there other key areas where we are seeing shared or similar tradecraft between Iran and Russia? And Kim, why don't I turn to you first?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think there's a lot of similar themes, especially outside of the financial sanctions. I think, it's still somewhat sanctions related, but on the export controls, that's where we're seeing a lot of similar trade crafts being used. And it's also kind of evident when you see that Iran's been supplying Russia with drones. And when you take apart those drones and you figure out what's inside, it's a bunch of US components. And so, there's a lot of shared tradecraft in terms of how they're getting these components, whether it's through China or other means and third parties. But there's a lot of circumvention and evasion that takes place in that space. There's also, a lot of similar techniques in terms of cyber and cyber attacks. While it may not be directly linked to the Russian government, there is a lot of Russian based ransomware groups that attack different entities across the Western space, and it's complicit with Russia. I mean, Russia is kind of like hands off with the ransomware criminals as long as they don't attack Russia. And ransomware, I mean, it's a huge issue that's on the rise. It's something that the United States as well as foreign partners are trying to address and figure out mechanisms to prevent it. But that's a growing problem. And again, just referring back to some of the Treasury designations, because there's a wealth of information in there, Treasury has also designated and sanctioned Quid Force and MOIS to entities that are part of the Iranian government for their involvement in ransomware as well as cyber attacks. And to Aurora and Debbie's points before, of like the developing new paths for money laundering. I mean, this is an area, right? Like if you're blocked off from the international financial system, you're going to try to figure out different mechanisms, and going after, having cyber attacks and using ransomware, which is all in a virtual currency. That's one way to do it. And not only are we seeing that with Russia and Iran, you also see it on the DPRK side.
Interesting. Aurora, would you care to add to that?
Sure, just very briefly, I think Kim did an excellent job covering it all. From techniques for sanction evasion or just master identity for any illicit activity. Really, the way that they use companies to mask their identities or to use cutouts, especially family members as cutouts. And again, this is largely in response to sanctions, but also again, the cyber. I think that's very important because you do see a lot of not only ransomware, but also other attacks like DDoS attacks, where the same tradecraft is used, where they'll actually lease infrastructure from infrastructure as a service companies. Again, they're just layer after layers of techniques to mask their own identities. So you have an anonymous company that's leasing, infrastructure from an anonymous company, and then you start, it's really hard to trace back. But then you see it's again many times state-sponsored entities from Russia, from Iran, from other countries that are conducting this activity, and they're all using very similar tradecraft.
Fascinating. Okay. Well, one, of course, important factor is throughout international relations these days, China. And I'm just wondering what anyone on the panel can tell us about Russia's and Iran's relationship with China and how this sort of facilitates their activities.
Yeah,
So, please.
I'll start. Yeah, it's trade, right? Because China is Iran's biggest trade partner, and they continue to buy Iranian oil, and they're getting it at a discounted price. They recently signed a 25-year strategic agreement to strengthen both their economic and their security cooperation. And then, of course, China is also Russia's largest trading partner. So, it in so many ways, China is boosting both economies. China is one of the biggest funders for Russia at the time, allowing them to continue their fight in Ukraine. I think Russia became the dominant supplier of weapons, advanced weapons to China. And so, between military and training, trade, China's instrumental to both of those, keeping economically afloat.
Interesting. And just to follow up on that, I read that with the war in Ukraine, how in other words, the Russian arms supply has become somewhat iffy, and I read that they're actually buying back weapon systems from India and Myanmar. I'm just wondering how much can the Russians transfer to China? In fact, if I were dependent on Russian arms supplies, I think I would be kind of unhappy right now because they need them for themselves.
For me? Or?
If you like, yeah.
Yeah, so obviously in the last 12 months, Russia's had a huge decline in their ability to produce weaponry. But up until February of last year, they were, I think, the largest supplier of advanced weapons to China. So, but yes, right now, Russia's working with Iran, obviously, to get weapons and their drones.
Interesting. Okay. Kim, can you tell us something about the China angle about all this?
Yeah, no, I agree with Debbie. Trade in particular is a huge issue. it's the the trade between Iran, the trade between Russia and China. I think what's also interesting in this space is that over the past couple of years, we have been seeing, China increasingly engage with the Middle East. I mean, the fact that they, brokered some type of peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, I don't think we can ignore that. That's something that we would not have really expected before. And I think that's also a result of, the US really kind of has turned away from the Middle East over the past few years, and China's coming right into that back door. Another aspect of this that I think we need to be paying more attention to is BRICS. I mean, China, tries to expand its influence around the world through different investment schemes. Not that great for the folks that are buying into them, but the Belt and Road Initiative is one of China's ways of expanding its reach. It's really capturing the message with the global South, and now with the BRICS move, which I'm sure most of you are all familiar with BRICS, but it's China, Russia, India, and South Africa. They've now expanded that group and offered invitations to Iran, as well as UAE and others to join this group. And I think that is China's way of trying to separate out and gain its own international recognition, as well as prop up the yuan and some of the things that it's doing in the trade space, and trying to encourage its trading partners to trade in yuan instead of dollars, and really starting to kind of bifurcate the international financial system and the trade that is predominantly done in US dollar. So I think that's something we all need to be on the lookout for and really start to dig into, because, we're seeing kind of this bad guy posse of, Iran, China, Russia, Syria, DPRK, they're all working together. And the United States and Western allies, because these groups are moving out of the Western financial system, we're starting to lose visibility into what type of activity is really going on there and how they're working together.
Mm-hmm. Now, I have looked myself at this question of the Chinese mediation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And as far as I can tell, this is not a peace agreement. All it was an agreement to resume diplomatic relations. And I'm not even really sure that China was necessary. In other words, that Saudi Arabia and Iran could have done this. And in fact, I think it was kind of for show. In other words, they wanted to be seen going to Beijing. I think the Saudis in particular, as a way of getting U.S. attention, sort of positive attention, and fewer demands, and provide more goods. Because it strikes me that China's ability to actually bring about peace is kind of limited. In other words, that conflict resolution is sort of an exercise often in coercive diplomacy. It's sort of an application of carrots and sticks. And I'm not sure that they're willing to apply sticks so much in the Middle East. In other words, I don't think that they could mediate between whether it's Israel or Hamas or anyone in Israel. It strikes me that their range is still limited. That they haven't. They're more involved in the Middle East, but that they really can't necessarily fulfill any kind of role that the locals don't want them to fill. It strikes me, but that's just my thought. Anyway,
actually,
now,
I agree with you, and I think practically and pragmatically speaking, I don't think China can really broker any type of peace. But I think the important aspect of this is the messaging side of it, and where China and Russia and even Iran to a degree, they're frankly kind of winning the message with the global South. So in South America, where Iran is very active there, Hezbollah is very active there. In Africa, where China and Russia are blaming Western sanctions for why they can't get fertilizer and grains and things like that, but really they can't get those commodities because of the actions that Russia is taking. So I think that China kind of just saying like, oh, we brokered peace, but really, if it was just more of a detente or they just showed up at a meeting, it's the messaging piece that goes along with it to kind of demonstrate where they are trying to help, but the US is not. So that I think there's a kind of an aspect there that
That's obviously very important. Aurora, did you want to add something to this?
Yeah, so with regard to China, I think one of the biggest things again is, again, going back to the dark fleet, to these oil sales. I mean, the biggest beneficiary of that is China. So, you have this scheme where it's Russia, Iran, China, they're the ones benefiting. All of them are benefiting from this scheme, and more has to be done to address it head on. Aside from, again, Debbie and Kim provided really great answers, but aside from that is also SIPS is another thing I wanted to mention. So what SIPS is, it's China's alternate to the SWIFT system, so the interbanking messaging system. And so, it's not as robust as SWIFT by any means right now, but what it is doing is, China is connecting more and more Russians, more and more Iranians, banks to the SIP system. So eventually, once it becomes more sophisticated, once it has more users, they will actually have a mechanism to completely evade the Western financial sectors and be able to evade future sanctions. Again, it's not there yet, but that is something that could be something we see in 10 years from now.
Very good. Now, I know I talked about this a bit before, but would anyone like to add anything about the global risks and consequences of the dark fleet, and perhaps maybe sort of in relation to trade with third countries, whether China, India, what have you? How about Aurora?
Yeah, I could talk about the dark fleet all day, but I think the global consequences I think we're seeing is due to the age of these ships, these vessels, and the fact that they are not, most of them are not really seaworthy. They are aging vessels. They don't have regular maintenance or regular inspections. Many of them, because of those reasons, are not insured. So they are actually very dangerous to be at sea. And also what adds to that danger is the fact that most of them, to evade, just detection, turn off their AIS systems, which, it means that there is no GPS locator on them. Other vessels don't see them. So as a result, you start seeing collisions at sea. Some of these actually become there's oil spills, there's fires, there's explosions. Some of them go to ground and they miss something and they get stuck at sea. So we see a lot of problems, and it's not only, again, with oil spills, environmental concerns there, but it's safe. It's a lot about the safety of the crew, safety of other ships. So you see a lot of consequences worldwide, and we've seen this from, I believe it was off the coast of, was it Malaysia? I believe a ship that exploded, and others. We've seen various ones catch fire. So again, there's a lot of dangers here. Again, not just for the environment, but for the actual people who are operating these ships.
Very good. Kim, can you add to that?
No, I think Aurora really hit all of the points. I think the environmental impact of this is huge, but I also think what's interesting about that piece is that maybe that is where we can get more of the international community involved and concerned on this, because there is growing concern about climate change. There is a lot, even that China is trying to do, recognizing that we need to do better on the environment. So that may be a hook that we could potentially use to work with other foreign partners to get them on board with complying with these different sanctions and trying to get these ships out of the ocean.
Very good. Now, Aurora, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, a lot of people don't remember, but it was one of these types of ships that was carrying the ammonia and nitrate when it moored in Lebanon. And then the ammonium nitrate had to be unloaded offshore from that ship that was found not to be seaworthy, and only obviously resulted in a huge explosion and the loss of life in Lebanon years ago. So, I mean, when they're talking about, I mean, they're single hull ships. They're carrying a lot of oil, and the environmental impact is one thing, but the risk to the population was very evident in what happened in Lebanon.
Yes, indeed. I remember that terrible, terrible episode. Speaking of Lebanon, Aurora, you recently co-authored a paper about the Hezbollah and Russia's nascent alliance, which I was very fortunate to read that paper, as well as Russia's encroachment in the Middle East. Can you just discuss that a bit?
Yeah, so again, Hezbollah, for those not familiar, Lebanese Hezbollah is a terrorist organization that operates, again, worldwide, but it's based out of Lebanon. And it's one of Iran's proxies, and it's probably it is Iran's strongest proxy. And what we've been seeing in the last few years is this growing relationship between Russia and Hezbollah. And, it's the relationship between the two is not new. It actually started, with Syria. So back to, 2012, you start seeing this relationship form based off of, the military need there. You had Hezbollah fighters and the Assad fighters and the Russian fighters all fighting side by side, right? But it has evolved. And again, I go back to 2018, where, there was this need all of a sudden for or not even a need, an opportunity for them to partner in a non-military capacity and to evade sanctions. Because again, the proxies, Hezbollah in Syria, it has easy access to Syria and can help Russia get its money out of there. And likewise, the proximity between Russia and Iran, Russia could help Iran move money to Hezbollah. And we saw that sanctions evasion scheme start. But again, sanctions is not the only, or sanctions evasion is not the only place where we're seeing this relationship. In 2021, we actually saw Hezbollah take its, I believe, its second ever diplomatic visit to Russia. They had done so a decade prior, but nothing really came of it. This visit was far more fruitful for them. It also was far more visible and public, and Hezbollah officials actually met with a huge array of Russian officials at this visit, to the extent that even the Russian officials offered for Hezbollah to open an office there. It's not clear if they have or not in Moscow, but that offer was provided. But as a result of this, what we're seeing is, more opportunities for Russia to invest in Lebanon. And it's not just, because we are seeing more attempts at Russian investments in the Middle East beyond just their arms agreements. But in Lebanon in particular, they are doing a lot of coordinating with Hezbollah. And one of the areas, or one of the projects in particular, is a project worth over $1 billion for Russia to restore one of the refineries in southern Lebanon, which is an area controlled by Hezbollah. And again, when you look at these refineries and you think about, well, how are they already cooperating? And you're looking at the oil trade. Well, you see, like, you start putting the puzzle pieces together. It's like, this is not just to benefit Lebanon or benefit the government of Russia. This is something that's going to benefit this terrorist group, which, I mean, if you're looking at the news right now, the big fear is that Hezbollah is going to go full on into a war that is going to set the, it's going to hit the dominoes, and it's just going to have this chain reaction of maybe a regional, if not global war, if that happens. And so we're starting to see, again, these cooperations and talks, and I think a lot of it is still in motion. There were last year or between 2021 and now conversations about for Russia to actually buy a Lebanese bank. I'm not sure if that went through, but there's also the talk of having direct flights from Russia to Lebanon, which we've seen as tradecraft that Iran uses to move weapons to Venezuela, for example. And actually now with this conflict occurring with Hamas, the Israelis actually bombed a military facility that Iran used in Syria, in Syria. And in response to this, there's reports of this that Russia is actually allowing Iran to use its military bases in Syria. So again, we see this
Did I hear you right that Russia's allowing Iran to use military bases inside of Russia, or did you mean the other way around?
No, Russia is allowing Iran to use its bases in Syria, and at least those are reports. Yeah, the reports have come out this week, and so again, we see this growing relationship with Russia, not only with Iran but with its terrorist proxies, and it's something of concern just moving forward.
But that has real implications for the Russian-Israeli deconfliction agreement. That the Russians turn a blind eye to Israeli targeting of Iranian and Hezbollah positions, just as long as the Israelis don't attack Russian positions. But if the Iranians are using Russian positions, then obviously they are limiting the degree to which Israel can attack them. That's a fascinating development. Anyway, moving on. Debbie, you've been working in Central Africa for some 7 years. How have you seen Russia's footprint change over the past decade?
It's sad and interesting at the same time. It's like watching China, as Kimberly was saying, the Chinese footprint inside Africa is just huge. Well, Russia, up until 2022, when the invasion into Ukraine, was the largest weapons provider for sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, everybody's been following and monitoring the Wagner Group for the last 2 years. I mean, obviously prior to that, but I mean, they've really been in the news the last 2 years. And the Wagner Groups, has been working in Libya, Mozambique, Mali, Central African Republic, DRC, and Burkina Faso. And there was really a very interesting report put out recently by CNN working with the Century, really laying out the war crimes and atrocities that are being committed by the Wagner Group in CAR. And evidence has indicated that the Wagner Group was also behind the death of 500 civilians in Mali, a massacre that occurred there. So you've got Russia not only providing weapons, but providing training to military groups within Central and Sub-Saharan Africa. But now they're also providing mercenaries. And that has had a devastating effect to stability in Central and Sub-Saharan Africa.
That makes me think. I mean, obviously, certain African governments have decided to, dismiss the French, and they see the Russians as more effective. But as you indicated, the Russians, Wagner kills an awful lot of people. And I can't help but wonder if there's a counterproductive effect. In other words, do they produce more terrorists than they get rid of?
Well, I think that's a very interesting side effect. But it comes down to a lot of the people that the trained mercenaries are fighting against are just not as well trained. So, obviously, when you have a massacre of civilians, that brings a lot of animosity to the mercenaries that are working in Africa. But you're talking about the civilians against the military. And if it's government-backed violence, which is like in South Sudan, in CAR, and other places, there's just very little, they don't have the money or the weaponry or the training to go up against them.
Very interesting. Okay. All right. Very good. Aurora, turning back to you, what can you tell us about Iran's transfer of drones to Russia?
Yeah, so that's a development that was it some I forget exactly when it has started or came on the radar last year. Caused a lot of concern. And I think the biggest thing of note here is that they're not, I mean, although they've denied, Iran has denied it, sometimes still tries to cover it up, that they're passing the drones and some of the drone technology to Russia. It's the tradecraft it's using. They're not trying to hide it via procure, like these networks or like these arms networks that are smuggling things over. I mean, they're flying Iranian planes, cargo planes to Russia and just dropping it off. I mean, it's a tradecraft that Iran uses, when it's moving weapons or drones to Venezuela or to Syria for Hezbollah's use. It's the same tradecraft. The concern too is that it's not just that Iran is providing this to the technology to Russia now. It's that yesterday, for those who have been paying attention to the news and to dates, UN sanctions against Iran's ballistic missile program ended yesterday. And so now what we've seen in this concern of Iran transferring drones to Russia, well, now the door has been opened, and there is now the capability that, or the possibility that Iran can start transferring ballistic missiles, not only to Russia, but to other entities, to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to the Houthis, to name the group, but is now allowed to transfer these weapon systems. And that should be a big concern, especially like now. Again, you look at the other conflict. There's a question here about what do you think about Russian influence to Iran supplying Arab-Israeli conflict? As far as the drones are concerned, you look at the drones that Hamas is using. That's something new. Hamas wasn't using drones like that, in the last conflicts. They have rockets, they have mortars, they have small arms, but they have not used that type of drone. And if you look closely, those are Iranian drones. That's Iranian technology. So again, it is something of concern. And I think with the UN sanctions resolution ending yesterday, it should be a bigger concern to the world, that now Iran is able to move this type of, not just the suicide drones or the attack drones, but now ballistic missiles to their allies and around the world, but also they could receive them. And you have the possibility of Iran receiving and being able to be the recipient in trade of intercontinental ballistic missiles. So that again should be of high concern.
Yeah, I noticed that the Russian Foreign Ministry made note of the fact that the UN sanctions have expired. One question that I have actually was something that Heather Marquette raised that somehow disappeared from my screen. A question that I've long asked. She kind of just compared sanctions to antibiotics that it was essential in some cases, but potentially destructive when used inappropriately or too often. In other words, are we running into diminishing marginal returns? Like we have so many sanctions on so many different countries, especially Russia and Iran. What does each additional sanction produce beyond sort of telling ourselves that we're doing something? In other words, do additional sanctions at this point actually, limit Iran or Russia more appreciably than the ones that have already been in place? Anyway, any and all who would care to address this, I personally would really like to know.
Kimberly, you want to go?
Sure, and I'll turn to you, Debbie. I think I do like the analogy. I've heard some people talking about antibiotics versus poison. when it comes to sanctions lately. It's a good way to think about it sometimes, because it tries to be the medicine, and then it can also kind of hurt. I think we are at a point where we really need to be focused more on the enforcement and implementation of existing sanctions than continue to develop new sanctions. Not to distract from the Iran-Russia conversation, but to kind of carry on what Aurora was discussing with the current situation between Israel and Hamas. It's great. Treasury designated more Hamas officials yesterday, but Hamas is already a designated foreign terrorist organization. It has a lot of sanctions already put in place against it, and it is blocked out from the international financial system, of which sanctions would deny it. So at a certain point, at what point do sanctions just become an action for action's sake and a press release to show that we're doing something, versus really trying to implement and enforce the sanctions that are already in place? And I think, especially when you look at Russia, when there's something like 13,000 designations just from the US alone against it, like, how do we start really enforcing them to do what they're intended to do, to deny Russia its ability to resource and fund this ongoing war? And it's still doing that. So we got to get a little bit more creative on how we can enforce these efforts. But Debbie, I'll turn to you.
Yeah, and there is a point of diminishing returns, except like the use of klepto capture, right? I'll use that as one example, because there were a series of oligarchs who thought they were untouchable, right? It never occurred to them that they would lose their $250 million yacht or their aircraft. And so that was a very creative, powerful tool in the sanctions realm. But yes, one of the most frustrating things for me as somebody who helps gather the information that will help lead to sanctions is that, for example, in South Sudan, we sanctioned an individual and his businesses, and within 3 weeks, he incorporated a new business on which his wife was the CEO, and immediately was awarded billion-dollar contracts. So I think part of enforcing the sanctions that we have in place is having people whose job it is to see how are they circumventing them, right? And then attacking those. So not maybe new ones, but new sanctions to just really enforce the ones that we've already got in place. Because the moment someone's sanctioned, the first thing they're going to be thinking about is, how do I get around this? And so our sanctions are not effective if, in those rare occasions or not so rare occasions, within weeks or months, they have found a way around and are now skirting the sanctions. So we need to enforce the sanctions that we have, find a better way to track their successful, their rate of success, but also recognize that those people are actively trying to skirt them, and at least trying to identify those methods so that we can cut those off before they become viable ways to skirt sanctions.
And
Very good.
I'd like to
Please.
add, again, Kim and Debbie gets really just captured most of it here. And the only thing I'd like to add here is, again, sanctions is only one tool in the policymakers' toolkit that they could use to try to change behavior or protect the financial sector or whatnot. Like they're not supposed to be used by themselves, right? It's not an isolated tool. So they're most effective when they're part of a greater policy and plan. We could put, again, as Kim said, we could throw sanctions at Hamas, at Iran, at Hezbollah, at Russia, all we'd like, but if we're not enforcing those sanctions, and if there's no other mechanisms, they're just going to find ways to evade them. And it's not just the bad actors who are trying to evade the sanctions, but it's also like, if there's no consequences for entities, whether it's exchange houses or banks or companies, to enforce the sanctions, if they just, if they could get away with it and with no consequences, they're going to continue behavior that may just be providing them with profit. If they have to pay a fine, sometimes the bad action, outweighs the fine. So there has to be consequences for those who allow transactions to continue. But again, the sanctions themselves have to be enforced, and they have to be part of something greater. Example, again, going back to the dark fleet, sanctions by themselves are not going to stop a ship in the ocean. That has to have something else. Something has to complement the sanctions to be able to actually be completely effective, because otherwise it's just a half measure. It could be very symbolic, but it won't actually have the effect that it needs to have or is intended to have.
Okay, thank you. Now, we only have about 4 minutes left, so I have a question that I'd like to hopefully each of you would address in 60 seconds or less. And what concerns you most about the Russia-Iran alliance? Kim, we'll start with you, please.
Sure. It's at least my concerns, I think we kind of talked a lot about throughout the course of the discussion, but when I look at this relationship, I see two heavily sanctioned regimes, and they are working closely together along with entities like China. And I'm concerned about what that means in the long run. So not in the next 2-3 years, but further down the road of 10 years or so. What does that mean for the ability for Western style sanctions to actually work against these types of adversaries? And what that also means for the US economy and the international financial system if these types of countries that are sanctioned start just working together to develop their own trade economies and like a shadow financial.
Very good. Thank you. Debbie, your 60 seconds.
I got a long list. I mean, there's the drug trafficking that's coming out of Afghanistan that is being facilitated by both Iran and Russia. There is the fact that Russia is trying to build a drone factory that by 2025 is supposed to produce 6,000 self-detonating drones. So what does that speak? How does that speak to security in the area? Russia is helping Iran develop their nuclear program, or has been for the last so many years. They're providing support to Syria with arms. So, I mean, there's just, when you're looking at instability in the world, you're looking at Russia, Iran, China, Syria, and North Korea. And having those five work together, it just creates instability all over the world.
Great, thank you. Aurora.
Yeah, so again, just building on the instability factor or element of this, my biggest concern with Russia and Iran, especially with the weapons trade, the financial aspect between the two is they're both very anti-Western entities, right? And so my concern is actually more with the Iranian side. And it's because it's not just Iran, it's Iran and its proxies. And so this is the Hamas, the PIJ, Hezbollah, the Iraqi Shia militia groups, the Yemeni groups, the groups in Bahrain. These are groups that have not just regional reach, but worldwide reach. And my concern there is that the growing relationship between Russia and Iran is a threat to Western countries and also Gulf countries, and really to anyone who's anti-Iran. Or who Iran has sees as its enemies.
Very good. Okay, well, I think we've really come to the end here. I think we're about to be shut off. I just want to thank all the panelists as well as the audience. I think for a very interesting discussion. I certainly learned a lot, including some things I wish I hadn't learned, but that's life, I suppose. But this panel really, I think, has been quite a success. I want to thank Aurora in particular for all her organizational efforts at putting this together, and for including me. So it's kind of nice when a student can include a professor in an activity. So I think that I think this is basically it. I'm not quite sure when we're going to. I think it's less than a minute that the session is just going to be shut off. So I'll just leave.